As I said, our presentation this morning is Systematic Changes in the Ventilation Industry and Decentralized Ventilation with Dara McGowan. A bio on Partel, who Dara works for. Partel is an Irish company with a global presence and a leading position in producing and supplying high-performance systems and products for the low-energy building sector. Partel produce and supply materials for air and wind-tight systems, thermal bridge mitigation products, and ventilation systems. Dara is a technical consultant at Partel. He is a certified passive house designer and tradesperson, and tradesperson, and a former BR assessor. He says, "Dara, you're never a former BR assessor."
Yeah.
American president.
You're in it for life.
You're always Dara McGowan, BR assessor. Dara has a strong background in ventilation, having developed and taught the national ventilation training courses run by the ETB, which was developed in response to the Part F 2019. While he still plays a role in training, he now spends most of his time designing ventilation systems for various building types, including residential, school, office projects. In this morning's presentation, Dara will focus on the systematic changes that have occurred in the ventilation industry since the introduction of Part F in 2019. He will focus on the new quality assurance requirements and validation process. Dara will also demonstrate how decentralized ventilation systems can be modeled in DEEP. Partel have been supplying decentralized ventilation systems to the Irish and UK markets since 2013. And so this process is something they're very, very familiar with. If you have any questions during it, we might take a break kind of in the halfway through and put some ventilation kind of questions to Dara. And so type in your questions in the chat function. Any technical stuff, somebody, either myself or some of the team will pick up and answer as things go on. So we'll hopefully put them questions to Dara at the end. So without further ado, Dara, I'll hand over to you. And thank you very much for joining us.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Stephen. I'll just share my screen here, make sure I get the presentation up. Oh, yep. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, I can see your front page. That's it. Yeah, perfect.
Perfect, perfect. And I'll just get a pointer out here as well. Great. Okay, so thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here. When I said former BER assessor, I suppose it's something I'm less active in now, but even when I kind of went down the route of becoming a BER assessor, it was more to dig into deep, kind of from my own knowledge as opposed to publishing BER. So I didn't get into publishing on a regular basis. It was more to kind of fit in with the rest of my role. So I suppose that's what I meant by that. So I think Stephen has covered most of, I suppose, my background in terms of the introduction. I do a lot of passive house design, but I also do lots of design for NZ projects, retrofit schemes, retrofit schools, all of that sort of stuff. So I suppose here in Partel we'd cover new build, retrofit, passive house, NZ, lots of different, I suppose, types of ventilation. We also have centralized and decentralized systems. So we kind of cover quite a broad, I suppose, spectrum in terms of ventilation. Again, I think you've covered most of this quite well, Stephen, so I won't dwell on it for too long. I suppose we are based here in Ireland, but we work in the UK, Europe, and North America as well. The rest of the stuff I think you've covered are the, I suppose, the manufacturers that we work with on our ventilation systems. So we work with Lunas, which is a German-based company for our decentralized ventilation, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And then we use Vasco for our centralized ventilation systems. So they might be kind of units that I suppose a lot of BER assessors would be more familiar with, a big unit that's then ducted to all the other rooms. I'm not going to focus on that too much today because I think it's something that, everybody in the room might imagine is quite familiar with, but of course during the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss any of those sorts of topics as well. But instead, we're going to focus on the validation process, the quality assurance, and then we're going to get into some decentralized ventilation calculations as well. So just in terms of the validation process, I know some BER assessors are validators, so maybe some people on the call already are aware of this, but lots of others aren't. So I'll run through it just step by step. There's essentially 3 stages to becoming a validator. But before I get into those, I just want to explain why independent validation is now required. So in the 2019 refinement to Part F and the new version of Part F, there was a little section there that referred to quality assurance, and they basically outlined, the department outlined 2 things in that. So anyone who's designing, installing, or commissioning ventilation systems has to be deemed competent. So that's the first point. So everybody in our office here, for example, would have to be able to prove they're competent in ventilation design to be allowed to do that. It's now a requirement for Part F. We have an install team here in Partel as well. All of those guys would have to be deemed competent to I suppose, to be allowed to install, and the same with commissioning. And we'll talk about how that's done later on, how you prove competency. But then on top of that, the Department of Housing also put in a requirement for independent validation of every ventilation system. So from here on, every new build in Ireland now has to have an independent validator. They're typically registered with either NSAI or INAB. They have to come into your property at the very end and physically measure flow rates to see if the property is compliant with Part F. It's similar to the blower door, I suppose, the blower door test, which I'd imagine a lot of people on the call are familiar with. So it's actually under a very similar scheme, and lots of blower door testers are offering validation as a service now. But essentially what it means is there's no more hiding, poor ventilation. You can't just put in a unit and tell the homeowner that it's grand. Someone will actually come in and measure that. And if the flow rates aren't being achieved, it's a pass-fail test. So your house can actually fail compliance once the validator takes flow rates on site. So on paper, it's a really positive move. Obviously there's a little bit of an expense in that, and it's comparable to the cost of a blower door test. But in terms of quality of indoor air quality, it's really making a difference in the fact that, I suppose, it removes people who don't know what they're doing from the industry. You have to either upskill or else, I suppose, just have been in the industry for a long time and know what you're talking about. But ultimately, the flow rates have to be there or the system won't be signed off on. So step one to becoming a validator is the completion of the NZ ventilation course. So that's the course that Stephen mentioned in my introduction there. That's a course that's it's a national course. It's run by the ETBs. So the WWETB developed it, but it is now spreading out to other ETBs. Basically, that course covers design, installation, and commissioning of ventilation systems in accordance with Part F. So it'll teach you how to work out flow rates, rules and regulations that are outlined in Part F, and so on. Now, that's a requirement if you want to design ventilation systems, but if you want to become an independent validator, it's actually optional, but NSAI strongly recommend you do that course before you go along on the NSAI scheme. This is one of the training centres. That's the hall that you do your exams in. So there's different ventilation systems in each one of these bays, and you actually go in and commission the system, and then you validate the system as well. So you're physically taking flow rates, you're adjusting diffusers, you're running ductwork, and so on. The next stage then is the ventilation proficiency test. So that's run in the same training centre here as well. There's only one of those in the country actually. But that's a mandatory requirement before you can become an NSAI independent validator. And basically it's a big kind of a box that's in the middle of a room. It has 2 supply valves and 2 extract valves, and you have to take 20 readings at different speeds. And there's an assessor there that are taking measurements to make sure that your number matches the number that it should be. So essentially what we're checking there is, can the independent validator, number 1, use their equipment correctly? And that's actually the main reason for failure in validation. They haven't got their equipment set up properly, their anemometers are not calibrated, they have the wrong setting selected, or something along those lines. And the second thing we're checking there is, can you actually take flow rates? It's not as easy as it might sound. It's not rocket science, but at the same time, there is a knack to it. You have to know what you're doing. So that's being tested during that phase. So assuming you pass that test, you can then apply to become an independent validator. So I suppose NSAI didn't want people turning up and not knowing how to use their equipment and messing around like that. So you go through the proficiency test, that proves you know how to take flow readings and so on. And then you can apply to become an NSAI independent validator. INAB is an alternative as well, and that's a whole different methodology. The NSAI is by far the more popular, I suppose, route of independent validation. So basically, when you apply to, Gary O'Sullivan runs that scheme, you apply to his department to become an independent validator. They will then get in contact with you and ask you to find a house in the local area, bring them out and actually validate a ventilation system in that house. So that means reviewing design calculations, turning up on site, taking flow readings, and then determining if that house is compliant or not. So basically, Gary would just stand back and watch you do that whole process, see if you're competent, and if you are, he'll sign off and off you go. You're an independent validator at that point. So there's currently 26 independent validators registered with the NSAI. I just had a look at that registration before we started, so that's the most up-to-date figure. I also know of a couple of guys that are registered with INABs, so there are a few of those, but they don't have a public registration that's as easily accessible. So, you know, there's 26 to 30 people in the country that are allowed to do these independent validations. They're spread out across the country. There's some in the West, obviously lots around Dublin and so on. So it's available. There are some challenges that we're facing at the moment, which I'll run through in just a few minutes. In terms of the ventilation training and that whole side of things, I'd really encourage it for BER assessors. You know, number one, it's super interesting. It's a really interesting topic. But as well as that, I suppose it's an opportunity to really get to understand regulations. And if you do get asked about ventilation, you know, you're technically on paper a competent designer. So when you pass the exam, that's part of that training, you're then deemed competent. And therefore, I suppose you have some paperwork, you get a little cert to say that you're competent. So you can talk with a little bit more confidence about ventilation, and you have some paperwork to show that I suppose you know what you're talking about essentially. So ventilation training is currently available in 2 ETBs. So the WWETB have a training centre in Enniscorthy, and LOETB then have a training centre in the Midlands. There are 3 other centres at various stages of development. So there will be one in Sligo, Cork and Limerick as well. So the courses are blended at the moment. There's some online training and some in-person training. That's starting to go back into the classroom now, you know, as we're moving out of the pandemic. So it's mostly in class at the moment. That figure of 300 is not the very latest figure. So just before Christmas, there was about 300 people had gone through that training nationally. So there's about 300 people, I suppose, that were deemed competent through that training scheme. Now, I suppose the numbers are starting to slow down for that. A lot of people have gone through the ventilation training, but there's lots of people like BER assessors, for example, they're not directly involved in the ventilation industry. They're not designing systems every day, but I feel would really benefit from that. Which is why I wanted to cover a little bit of detail today. Now, this particular slide, I suppose, is a call to arms to a certain extent. It's something that I think BER assessors can help with. So there are a lot of challenges that we're faced with in terms of the independent validation scheme. You know, it's been in place since 2019, and we're still hitting road bumps. I suppose it's not really as smooth as we would have liked. Initially, I would have worked very closely with NSAI and the Department of Housing when developing this whole validation scheme. And I suppose on paper at the time when we had kind of put the whole thing together, we thought it would be super smooth. It was really easy. It would really improve the quality, but there has been some challenges. So the first one of those is a lack of compliance. So basically, we know that there are way more houses that should have had an independent validation test done than actually had one done, if that makes sense. So lots of people have built a new house since the new regulations came in, and therefore require independent validation to be compliant with Part F. But a huge majority of those are not going down that route. So there was a figure released by the Passive House Plus magazine just before Christmas. Basically, they found that out of 7,500 houses approximately that required independent validation, only around 900 actually got it done. So there's an issue with compliance, and that's where I feel BER assessors would have a really, I suppose, could have a powerful role there. You know, you guys and girls are involved in the housing, in each individual new build. You know, you have to get your BER or your provisional BER. Even if it's as simple as saying, you know, have you considered independent validation? It gets the homeowner thinking about it. Maybe they might start to reach out to independent validators. Maybe some of the people on the call are independent validators. So I suppose there's a business opportunity there to an extent as well. But more importantly, we just want to increase the amount of independent validation across the country. They're looking at ways of, I suppose, clamping down on this a little bit, but ultimately at the moment, it's word of mouth. Building control are supposed to actually clamp down on it, but as you know, they're severely understaffed, and it's very difficult for them to actually pick up on this sort of stuff. I suppose the next problem is assigned certifier knowledge. So to be honest, a lot of assigned certifiers, they're the ones that sign off on the house and then submit that to building control, and building control are ultimately relying on the assigned certifier's signature to say, oh yeah, they said it's all good, so it must be all good, you know. But unfortunately, a lot of design certifiers actually don't know that independent validation is required, and that's by no fault of their own. They need to know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. They have plenty of other, I suppose, concerns and issues that they need to address. But again, as a BER assessor, oftentimes, I suppose you'd be in contact with the assigned certifier to a certain extent. And again, it might just be worth raising the point, have you considered independent validation? Because ultimately that will lead to better indoor air quality over the years. That's the idea of the whole scheme. And finally, unfortunately, it's not just to do with getting people to be, I suppose, independently validated. Even when they are validated, lots of them are not compliant. So basically, the majority of houses that were audited by NSAI, so there have been around 900 houses tested at the last update of those figures, which was just before Christmas. And there was 22 of those validations were audited by NSAI. So Gary or one of his colleagues actually turned up on site and sat with the validator while they were going through the process. So 20 out of 22 of those houses that were audited by NSAI didn't comply with the regulations. So that's not to say the independent validator didn't do their job. They identified that they weren't compliant, but the vast majority of houses were under-ventilated. So it's a huge, huge problem. Even brand new houses built since 2019, built since the new regulations came into play. Even with that, even with a detailed design, they're still just being installed and not compliant with ventilation regulations in many cases. So super frustrating, but that's not something I suppose that BER assessors have a lot of control over. But I just want to make you aware that, the first 2 points where you can ask for independent validation or you can suggest it possibly, I think that's a really good move towards getting more people to be validated, and therefore the quality will improve over time. And maybe we won't have so many non-compliant houses, maybe, in 4, 5, 6 years' time. So I think, Stephen, we had said we might just break for a second on that. There's a kind of a natural break in the content. We're going to move into some more technical stuff after. So
yeah, thanks, Dara. That's really interesting, and I think it's really important that the whole approach we take to our build and design is going to work for the end user at the end of the day. The integrity of the whole thing. It's really important that that these ventilation systems are going to be working properly when people have spent a lot of money, because we're all mixed up in this blame game if something goes wrong.
Absolutely.
So, absolutely.
And especially as we get more airtight, again, all the people on the call here would see the airtight number that's being input just coming down and down and down all the time.
Yeah, the numbers are kind of scary that you're saying there that it's not happening. One question has come in is just to confirm, what is the requirement for validation? Is it every house that has a mechanical ventilation, DCV, etc., or does natural ventilation rule you out of it, I guess?
No, so every single house needs independent validation. So the validation process is slightly different for natural ventilation. In that case, you're actually looking at background vents and the size of those and the number of those. I'm not going to get into it today, but calculating your flow rates for mechanical is a little bit different than for natural as well, So your intermittent fans in bathrooms, cooker hoods, they'll all be measured as well. So there's no get out of jail free card, unfortunately. It's every
so the regulations, Part F, say that every house must have an independent validation.
Yeah,
that's great. And I have a question in from Stephen as well. Different Stephen, is the ventilation validation requirement for non-domestic buildings also, or is it just domestic?
So at the moment, it's just domestic. There are some, I suppose, references to non-domestic in Part F, but it's primarily focused on domestic.
Okay, and Niall has asked, is validation requirement for refurbishments, or I guess he means, is it just new build, or is retrofitting going to come under it as well?
It's an interesting question, I suppose. That ties into Part L with major renovations and so on. As you know, if it's over a certain surface area, it becomes defined as a major renovation. But in the regulations, if you look closely, there's actually kind of a feedback loop that doesn't give you an answer, unfortunately. So, it kind of says refer to Part L to see if it's a major renovation. And then when it's a major renovation, it says refer to Part F to see what ventilation requirements you have to follow. So it's kind of it's a frustrating circle that doesn't really give an answer. So
that major renovations category is a little bit like that. There's an out. There always seems to be an out then.
There seems to be, yeah.
So you're trying to advise the right thing to do, and then another person's opinion might be, well, there's an easier way out of this. So
yeah. To be honest, in terms of in terms of what happens in reality, so we do lots of retrofits, and you'd see with the decentralized system why it's so popular with retrofitting. It's quite an easy system to install in an existing property, but we'd always go for Part F compliance. And to be honest, it doesn't make any difference in terms of cost. Ultimately, obviously, people ring us up, they say, look, I want good indoor air quality. I don't really know what I want, you tell me. So the best target for us is Part F compliance. So for most of our retrofits, whether it's required or not, we would go for Part F compliance.
Okay, but I'm not sure it was a question or a point. Capital letters there from Morris Murphy. Validation required for SAI grant aided refurbs. That is the national home retrofit scheme. So it's the same thing, isn't it?
It's an interesting. I actually don't know the answer to that yet. I haven't got stuck into the new grant aided work in much detail. It hadn't, it wasn't part of the deep retrofit. The older deep retrofit, as far as I was aware, because it came in sort of as that was coming out of SAI grants. So
is that a fact, Morris? Or I don't know, Morris might tell us, is that a fact, or is it a cry for help?
No, he's answering.
Hi, Stephen, it's Morris here. How are you doing? No, I'm saying that it is required if you're doing a national home retrofit. SAI require validation.
Okay,
that's great.
That's in the guidelines that were released yesterday, is it?
No, it's been for the last year and a half, for the prior to the like the national home retrofit, that we've got the uplifted grants that were announced a couple of weeks ago. It's been in place since the national home retrofit came in place. What's that, a year and a half ago?
Okay,
so it's been a requirement for the last roughly 2 years.
Good. I got a copy of them guidelines last night, and I fell asleep reading them. They came out for the new one-stop shop, so I presume it's in there as well. Then, if it was, so that's good news for all. Okay, I think that's all the questions we had in there for the moment. If anyone has more questions on this topic, send them in to me. We can put them to Dara at the end. So I think we'll let you go on with your second part of the presentation.
Very good. It's going to get a bit more technical, so I hope everybody can bear with me. It'll all kind of filter back into a solution at the end. So the first thing I want to do is just introduce it to decentralized ventilation, explain how it works, because otherwise the calculations don't make any sense. So I'll give a very kind of high-level introduction. We're going to be looking at MVHR and hybrid systems today. In Part F, as most of you might know, there's natural ventilation, CMEV, like continuous extract, and MVHR. But with decentralized, you can actually mix and match a little bit. So you can go for what we call a hybrid ventilation system, which is what I'm going to cover today. But basically, our heat recovery units, instead of having a big unit in, let's say, the attic space, for example, we have these smaller units that go directly in the external wall. So you core out a hole, you put these units in, and these all go in habitable rooms. So bedrooms, sitting rooms, study rooms, and so on. Now, what happens is this little fan runs for 70 seconds and it extracts warm air out of the building. That heat then gets held in this ceramic core. That's called a regenerative heat recovery system, as opposed to a counterflow, which would be the more common, bigger units. So this is a regenerative heat recovery system. So that essentially gets charged with heat during the extract phase. Then after 70 seconds, that fan changes direction and starts to draw cold air in from the outside. So it's cold, fresh air. But as it passes through that core, it gets preheated. So it sucks the heat out of the core to preheat that air. So that's how the heat recovery units work. Again, very sort of simple explanation, and I'm more than happy to go into that in more detail during the Q&A. But in terms of, I suppose, airflow rates and so on, I suppose it's more important to understand how the system works as a whole. So let's have a look at this floor plan here. This is a full MVHR system. So basically these E260s, which are the ones I just showed you, they go in habitable rooms and they don't go in any wet rooms. And I'll explain why in just a second. Now, all of these units talk to each other through a centralized controller. So this one, for example, is connected to this one. They're working together through the controller. So as this one sucks air into the building, the one on the opposite side is exhausting air out of the building. So they work as a pair and they oscillate over and back. So after a 70-second period, these will go into reverse. This one will become a supply, and this one will become an extract. So they're creating this gradual movement of air throughout the building. Of course, we need undercuts in doors and so on. That's now a requirement in Part F for every house. Natural ventilation, mechanical ventilation, it doesn't matter. You have to have gaps under your doors or some sort of a route for air to flow. And again, we can get into that in more detail later. Then in our wet rooms, like kitchens and bathrooms, we use these units called E-GOs. So they're from the same manufacturer, they're Lunos again, but these fans actually have, these units have 2 fans built into them. And they're not connected to a fan at the other side of the house. The reason for that is, you know, if you're cooking up a chicken curry here, you don't want to be dragging that odor and humidity all the way across the house. You want to extract it at the source. So we still do have a cooker hood to deal with really high demand, but in all of our other wet rooms, the kitchens and bathrooms and so on, air is being pumped out one side of this unit and sucked in the other side. So one fan is supplying while the other is extracting, and it creates a kind of a circular movement of air around the room. Now, after 70 seconds, that has to reverse, just like it did with the E260s. And the reason for that is it's all to do with this heat recovery process. That core is split in 2, and changing the air direction allows heat recovery to occur. So that's essentially, you know, how decentralized MVHR works. We have E260s in habitable rooms that are all connected together, and then E-GO units in wet rooms. And both of these recover heat through a regenerative process in those ceramic cores, all right? Now, this is where it gets interesting, and to be honest, this is the majority of the design work that we do. We can have a hybrid system. So what that means is we can have some heat recovery units and some continuous extract units. And I suppose there's a couple of reasons why you might do that. Reason number 1 would be if you have a centralized room, because these heat recovery units go directly into external walls, we can't put one in that room. It doesn't have an external wall. You know, if it's a bathroom under a stairs, for example, or something like that. So we'd use a Silvento unit. That unit there is a continuous extract unit. So it's running all the time, extracting at a low level, and then it can ramp up in response to demand. So if someone has a shower, for example, it will go up into a boost mode. But we can duct that out to the outside. Now, more typically, those units are used for budget reasons. So sometimes people say, look, I want to go for MVHR in my house, whether it be new or retrofit. I don't have a huge budget for it. I want to get the balance between comfort, air quality, and budget, right? So in that sense, we would put MVHR units, so our E260s, in all of our habitable rooms, so bedrooms and sitting rooms and so on, because that's where people spend most of the time. Their comfort levels are increased in the rooms that they're occupying. And then we put Silvento units, which are our extract units, in the likes of bathrooms and kitchens and stuff. And that's more to deal with the likes of humidity issues, odor issues, and stuff like that, okay? So we can kind of merge this whole system together. It's fully compliant with Part F. That's not something I have got in the slides today, but again, happy to go through all that in the Q&A, there's no problem. In terms of Part F compliance, there's no issue there. We've gone through it all. NSAI have approved of its validation process. But it can also be modeled in deep, and that's what we're going to go through today. So this is a little bit different to your standard. Let's say you just had a big MVHR unit in your plant room. That's quite easy. You know, you typically use the SAP database or something along those lines to get the efficiency and the specific fan power. Ultimately, they're the 2 figures that we need to model it in deep, as you know. This is done slightly differently. So it's covered in the domestic BER technical bulletin from July 2020. So that's a bulletin that we would have worked with SAI to help them. I suppose there's 2 things in that bulletin, by the way. There's some thermal bridge information, which it's not relevant today. And then there's the modeling of decentralized ventilation units in deep. We basically worked with SAI because they were getting questions around this particular system. You know, how do we actually model this in deep? You can't just take a standard heat recovery efficiency, because if you think about it, if I go back to this plan here, if I have some heat recovery units in bedrooms and then I have a non-heat recovery unit in a bathroom and maybe I have a heat recovery unit in a kitchen, all the efficiencies are different. So the heat recovery efficiency and the specific fan power is completely different for all 3 of those units. So it's not as easy as let's just stick in a heat recovery efficiency. We need to work out an average that's representative of how the entire system works. That's what this bulletin outlines. So basically, this document outlines the methodology for including non-default fan powers and efficiencies, and it's specifically designed for decentralized or non-ducted whole house systems. So basically, all that's saying is we're not talking about the big MVHR units here, we're talking about decentralized or non-ducted units. Now, this is the key thing here. So this methodology is all based on eco-design and energy labeling directives for residential ventilation units. And it's a simplified weighting calculation to account for multiple units in a single dwelling. So to explain that in plain English, we're not using SAP data here. This all relies on eco-design data, so DOPs, essentially, you know, documentation that's tested to a certain standard, which I'll explain in just a second. And then we're weighting the numbers in the DOPs. So basically, if one fan works harder than another, that makes up a larger chunk of the efficiency than the fan that's not working very hard. So we have to take all of that into account. So again, I suppose the key thing for you guys and girls on the call today is this methodology negates the need to use SAP. And I know that probably really sticks in the craw of some BER assessors because it's very unconventional. We get lots of BER assessors calling us that are nervous about doing something like that in terms of audits. But you know, this document is not something that I've made up or anybody in Partel has made up. This is an SAI published document to account for these types of systems. So it's safe to do that. The one thing you do have to watch out for is that you have the right evidence to present to SAI upon auditing, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So the calculations that we're going to go through are required to basically to derive a weighted average specific fan power and heat recovery efficiency to enter the system into deep. So as everybody knows, we need a specific fan power and an efficiency to go into deep. You know, it's not much good me telling you, well, you have 3 different ventilation units in there. Here's the 3 efficiencies, because there's nowhere to put them. They all have to go down into one efficiency and one specific fan power. So systems using this guidance must always be entered into deep as a whole house balanced mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery, if they have a heat recovery component. So basically, you know, the drop down in the ventilation tab in deep, we're entering these as whole house MVHR essentially. That's assuming that you're using some heat recovery units, which we are in the hybrid system. If the systems provide mechanical extract only, then they must be entered into deep as a whole house mechanical extract ventilation system. So I suppose what we're talking about today is a blended system. Some of the units are MVHR, some are CMEV. It's much simpler if they're all CMEV, if they're all the exact same unit, because, you know, they're all doing the same amount of work. They all have the same efficiencies. It's much, much easier to actually model one of those. I don't want to have it too easy for today, so I picked one that's a little bit more complicated. So this is, again, all of these little snippets on the left-hand side here are directly from that technical bulletin from SAI. So when calculating deep inputs for the LUNAS system, which is what we're going to look at today, we use eco-design technical documentation. And that's, there's different ways that you're allowed to model these systems, but we go for this option B, which is eco-design technical documentation. And it has to be tested to these standards here, 1253/2014 or 1254, which is the one that we actually test to. So typically, just in terms of practicalities and how this actually works in reality, typically a Partel technical consultant will carry out the calculation and provide you with one heat recovery efficiency and one specific fan power for the entire system. Now, the only reason we do that is we have spreadsheets set up, which I'll show you later on. You know, we're really used to doing this. We do it all the time. But you see, it is a little bit different for every house. So it's a lot of work for a BER assessor. It's like the heat pump calculation. You know, I know this, and that's actually mentioned in this technical bulletin. There's some comparisons drawn as well between the modeling of a heat pump. You know, we can give you the information, we can do the calculation and provide you with evidence for SAI. So we would give you that calculation so you could submit it to show, well, this is how we got to this efficiency and specific fan power. In that bulletin, all of these points are outlined as, you know, relevant information that you can take from a DOP or an eco-design document. I'm not going to go through all those one by one, but there are 2 that are particularly important for us. So we're going to be looking at the SPI and at the heat recovery efficiency, and that is outlined in the bulletin as being okay to take from your eco-design documentation. So here's an example of our DOP for the E260, which is the heat recovery unit. Notice here that it's tested to the 1254, which is required, and it's outlined by SAI. So you can't just use any old information that comes in. It does have to be tested to a certain standard, which is what LUNAS have done. And the 2 key pieces of information we're going to use now is the thermal efficiency of heat recovery, which is 83% for the E260s, And we're also going to use the specific power input, which is 0.09 for the E260s as well, okay? Now, this is where it starts to get pretty boring, so hopefully I can keep everybody with me. It gets kind of technical here. So the first thing we need to understand is how to convert a specific power input, which is typically provided on a DOP, into a specific fan power. Maybe that's something that people are familiar with, but it's a pretty simple calculation to get us started. So your specific fan power, which is ultimately what we want, is your specific power input multiplied by 3.6. So that's just to convert from meters cubed per hour into liters per second, with the watts, of course, accounted for as well. So again, very simple example here for our E260, which is this unit. The SPI is 0.09 watts per meter per hour. That should be meters cubed, apologies. So 0.09 multiplied by 3.6. So the specific fan power for that unit is 0.32 watts per liters per second. Okay, so that's pretty simple. So if we were just using those units throughout the whole house, it'll be pretty simple. My presentation will be over. But of course, we do have to also have our extract units in wet rooms. So it gets a little bit more complicated. Now we're mixing and matching, so we have to account for that. So the specific fan power that we just calculated applies to the E260 units only. But like I said, we do typically mix extract units in with that as well. Or we could have different heat recovery units in bathrooms, even if it's a full heat recovery system, because the E2 are different to E260s, it's a different efficiency as well. So to enter an entire system into DEEP, we need to calculate an average specific fan power for the dwelling based on the specific fan power of individual units weighted by their flow rate and by the amount of time that they're actually used during the day. So those two factors have to be accounted for in our weighting calculation. So I hate calculations that are outlined like this. I find them super confusing, but that's what SEI have provided in their technical bulletin. So when we got that first, we had to sort of break that down into what exactly does that mean. So I've done it in what I think is a simpler way. Hopefully everybody else agrees. But essentially, just to talk you through this, we're taking into account our flow rates. We're taking into account how often they run. So are they running all day or are they intermittent? And we're taking into account the power input, so the specific power input, which we get from the DOP of the machines. Okay, so hopefully everybody is with me so far. So let's take a more complicated example. It's still not, a fully realistic example just yet, but let's assume we have one E260 and one Silvento unit, which is our extract bathroom units, no heat recovery and a completely different specific fan power to the E260s. The first thing we have to do is work out the flow rates based on the hours that the system runs and how much air moves through that system per hour. All right, so how hard is the system working? And how often is the system in that mode? Is it switched on all day? Does it run from time to time? How does that work? So in this case, we have the number of units. In this case, we just have one E260 in this example. We have how many hours a day does that unit run? So for the E260s, that's a 24-hour, it's a continuous MVHR system. Then we have the flow rate, that's 19. It's outlined in the technical bulletin that depends on the design. So we would work with Lunos to figure out what is the flow rate for that unit in this project. Okay, so that doesn't come from DOP data, that's project specific, let's say. And then this little number here is just to convert from meters cubed per hour to liters per second. So that gives us 126.67, and that's basically our flow rate based on how often it runs and how hard it runs in that time. It'll all come back to making sense now in just a second. Then we have to work out our specific power input, and we need to take into account how many hours does it run, how hard does it run, how often is it flowing, and of course the actual efficiency, so how much electricity is used. And that's based on our specific power input. So again, we have four figures here. We have the number of units per day. Again, in this case, we only have one E260. We have how often is it running? It's running 24 hours. The flow rate is the same, but this figure is different. So that's our specific power input, and that's the number we get from the DOP. Let's say it was really poor, used tons of electricity, that number would be way worse, but it's a decent number because they're quite efficient. Then we basically do the exact same process for the Solvento. We run all those calculations through as well. Now, the final piece in the puzzle is to connect how many hours and flow rates, like how much air is moving and how often is that moving for the entire system. So taking into account the heat recovery unit and the Solvento unit. Now you'll notice the Solvento unit has different running times and so it doesn't run as often, and I'll explain why that is in just a few minutes. That ramps up and down depending on demand, and its flow rate is smaller. So it's not driving as much air as the heat recovery unit is. So we add together these units. So again, our hours and flow rates are taken into account. So we add those two together for both units and it gives us a total. And then we also add together the specific power input. And again, that's taken into account how often does it run, how efficient is the unit, and how hard does the unit run, what flow rate is going through that unit. So we add the two together for both units. And finally, we divide one into the other to give us a specific fan power for deep. I know there's a lot of steps in that, but ultimately what we're doing is working out, okay, how many hours is our entire ventilation system running? And how much air is moving through that system in that time? And how much power does it require to move all that air? So that's what we're taking into account through all of these calculations here. So in this case, let's say we had one E260 and one Solvento. Our specific fan power that would be input directly into deep is 0.32. Okay. Now, that's only 2 units. I'll show you a full example in just a few minutes. Stephen, you're looking pretty confused, so I'm hoping you have questions for me after. But the next thing we have to look at then is our efficiency. So how efficient is the unit? So if you think about this practically, we have one heat recovery unit that's 83% efficient, and we have one extract unit that's 0% efficient. It's not recovering any heat, but they run at different rates. You know, it's not like they're carrying the exact same amount of air for the exact same amount of time. So we can't just divide it in two. It's a little bit more complicated than that. The calculations look super similar, and the flow rates, of course, are the exact same. You know, the running time doesn't change, the flow rate doesn't change. So that calculation is the exact same. Now, this one is slightly different. So in this case, again, lots of the numbers are the same. You have the number of units, the hours per day, the flow rate. But this time, instead of electrical efficiency, we're looking at heat recovery efficiency. So it's 83% efficient, or 0.83. So this gives us basically a weighted efficiency based on all the factors. How often is it on? How hard does it run? And what heat recovery capacity does the E260 have? Then we need to do the same calculation for the Solvento unit. Now, for anybody that's still clued in here, you'll notice the heat recovery efficiency, of course, is 0 for that unit. So that's going to drag down our average, isn't it? It's going to take our average down by a certain amount, but it doesn't run as often. So it doesn't pull it way down. It just has a minor impact on the efficiency. Then the process is the same. We add together our flow rates, we add together our efficiencies, and then we divide one into the other. So in this case, instead of having 83% efficiency, if we had only MVHR units, which is not practical, you just can't do that. When we blend MVHR and CMEV, continuous extract units together, we come up with efficiency of 75.6%. So that's basically the two calculations. I just have 2 or 3 more slides, so I'll wrap it up in just a second. I know I can see there's lots of questions coming in. That sounds like lots of work, but of course we have spreadsheets for that. So we have a spreadsheet that looks something like this. We decide how many of each unit we have. You know, it's even a little bit more complicated. We don't just have E260s and Solventos, we have lots and lots of other units. So basically what's working behind all of these numbers is the DOP data. So we have DOP data inputting into the heat recovery efficiency, the SPI, the flow rates, all of that sort of stuff. And so we have lots of data that feeds into this. So it looks like I work really hard, but I don't work quite as hard as it looks. We just put in figures into a spreadsheet that we've worked out based on this calculation methodology. And that's the spreadsheet that we share with our BER assessors. So that's our proof of, you can't see it here because it's just a screenshot, but below that in the Excel sheet, all the DOP data is in there, and we can provide DOPs, of course, as well. So that's, I suppose, your documentation to submit to SCAI. I wanted to show you an accurate example just before I wrap up, because 2 units is not going to ventilate an entire house. So this house, we haven't talked much about Part F compliance, but this is quite a large house. It's a 285 square metre detached house in Salt Hill here in Galway. It's fully compliant with Part F, so it's part retrofit, part new build, but they went in for Part F compliance, so it's completely compliant with Part F. Because of the size of the house, we needed 10 E260s, which is our heat recovery units in, see the bedrooms, for example. The little orange units then are Solvento units, so they're just continuous extract, and they're in all the wet rooms, as you notice, the bathrooms, the kitchen, and so on. And we have one next unit, which is this green unit. We didn't discuss that today, but it's just another heat recovery unit we have for larger spaces. So in this case, not only do we have different numbers of units, we actually have 3 units instead of 2. So it's kind of a complicated one. So the specific fan power for that entire house was 0.55, and the heat recovery efficiency was 77.2%. Now you might say, well, that seems kind of low, but the specific fan power is really good. And if they did decide to go for all heat recovery, which they could have if they wanted, that number, of course, would be bumped up. But they said, look, I want the balance between good heat recovery and a decent price. You know, he didn't want to be investing any more money than was required. So just to wrap it up then, this is the input into DEEP. So it's complicated until it gets to here. So by the time you guys get the figures, it's pretty simple. You know, you're inputting the unit as a balanced whole house mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. Your specific fan power for that Salt Hill house was 0.55. Your efficiency was 77.2. It's a hybrid system by Lunas, and there's 5 wet rooms in that case. So I suppose I'm going a really long way about saying, if you lean on us, for example, to do your calculations, and then we provide documentation for auditing, it's a pretty simple process. You know, there's not a huge amount to it from a BEO assessor's point of view, other than just making sure you have the correct documentation to submit to SEAI. So I think I got a bit over time, Stephen, but happy to take any questions at that point then.
No, that's very interesting, Dara. No, absolutely. We have 5 minutes left, or 6 minutes left till 12, so we have time for a few questions for sure. And yeah, I'm glad the Excel sheet popped up, because I was just thinking, well, this could be just all done in an Excel sheet, couldn't it? And the variables could be added later. A few questions coming in. So from Stephen again, is the ventilation? Oh, sorry, that's from the last one. Oh yeah, I suppose the first one that always pops up, I guess, is cost. If you yeah, how does it stack up with a mechanical ventilation system, I guess, in terms of cost?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the cost is comparable and sometimes even cheaper if you take all factors into account. So basically what we typically do is, you know, like a system like this doesn't have any drop ceilings. There's no duct work. There's no insulation for duct work. Nothing like that. So in the bigger picture, they're really competitive. We do lots and lots of developments with these types of systems. For example, now often developers don't want MVHR and they want CMEV, which is fine. We can do decentralized CMEV as well. But because they're not having to drop ceilings, run ductwork, everything like that, they're pretty good in terms of cost. The other thing with the cost is when we give you a price, you know, we can break it down item by item. There's no estimating of ductwork or guessing how much insulation we're going to need. You know, typically for an MVHR quote, it's somewhat pro rata. You know, maybe you need a little bit more, a little bit less in terms of ducting. That's not the case with these, so we can price them really accurately. You know, and sometimes what we'll do as well is give people the 3 options. So here's the price for full MVHR. Here's the price for hybrid, which, like I said, that's what 90% of our customers go for. And here's the price for CMEV. So you actually have 3 different proposals, all of which are compliant with Part F. It just depends on, at that point, I suppose, interacting with your BER assessor to see what do I need in terms of compliance, and then what am I willing to pay for in terms of comfort and heat recovery efficiency.
Okay, that kind of brings us on to another question that came in there was, I guess the variables like the flow rates. Obviously it's up to your design professional to decide what all them things are, so yourselves, so I presume you need all that in paper signed off documentation to go along with your Excel sheet. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so lots of that comes from basically in the DOP data. It gives a range of flow rates, so a lot of that is covered in that DOP document. But again, we're, I suppose, essentially, and it states SEAI are very clear on this in their technical bulletin. You know, it is down to the designer to decide on that flow rate, and for you guys, then it's just a case of getting documentation to prove where that came from.
So all them variables need to be backed up, obviously, by a competent professional and signed off. Another one there, if you had a room, which is a kitchen and a living room together, would you use the E260 or the Ego?
That's a good question. So that's a Part F compliance question, as opposed to a BER question, but I'm happy to answer. So let's say this is a perfect example. Here's a kitchen dining, and that wall actually was removed in reality. So there was an open plan kitchen living sitting area. You have to have an extract in the kitchen for Part F compliance. You can't comply without it. So the first thing is we definitely put an extract in there, whether that be a heat recovery extract unit or a CMEB unit. And then we would also put a supply into a living space. So in Part F, they're basically viewed as two separate rooms. It's an open plan space, but you draw a kind of an imaginary line down the middle. One is supply, one is extract.
Okay, good stuff. And Morris asked again, if you have a decentralized extract only system, do you use the guidance with SAP SFP data?
Yeah, there is guidance in SAP for that. You can use that if you want to. I suppose it gets a little bit more complicated and you go back to using the document I just spoke through if you're mixing and matching units. So we have different extract units that we can use. If you're using all the same ones, you can go with SAP data. There is a decentralized extract section in SAP, which I think you said Morris was the name's clearly familiar with that. But if, let's say, for example, we have a bigger extract unit here than we do here, then again, we have to get into working out our averages.
Very good. And John B says, how do you decide on the flow rates? Well, I guess that's the designer, again, is going to supply you with all the information.
Exactly. Yeah, that's so the two figures that basically SAI can't determine that are project specific are the flow rates, which we have to decide, and the running time, which we also have to decide. We typically take conservative for both. So, for example, depending on our Part F compliance, we might change it from 19 to 15 or something like that. But 19 is typically higher than usual, so we're playing it safe in that sense. The Sylvento units, you might wonder why they run for only a few hours a day. They are actually to deal with boost rates. So that's at 15 minutes an hour on average. And again, that's all determined by Lunos in terms of best practice install. So long story short, it comes from the designer.
Very good. And another John asks, what kind of equipment is required to complete a ventilation validation? So I think John's thinking of branching out into the career there.
Yeah, so there's basically what you need is an anemometer. So that's your piece of kit for measuring flow rates. And there's lots of different types of anemometer out there. There's kind of lower spec ones, which are perfectly fine. They're allowed. I've put people through the proficiency test with them. They're around £600-700 to purchase. I think you said John was his name. If you are thinking about getting into it, John, make sure you get a flow straightener with your anemometer. That's one piece of kit that people often forget. If he wants to reach out separately, I can send him on some details on that. And then there's bigger units that cost, $4 or $5 grand, and they don't need a flow straightener. They're more sophisticated. They balance themselves. But that's all you need, just an anemometer.
Okay, maybe a quick one here. What are the noise levels like, say, in bedrooms for these units?
Yeah, so that's a good question. They're actually really good. I have one just above my head here in the office, actually, so I wouldn't stick it if it wasn't loud. I can send down data on that. I honestly don't know the numbers off the top of my head. But they're super quiet, and even when they change direction, because the flow rates are so gradual, you don't hear them. People kind of tend to get, let's say, the extract units or the supply units confused with, decentralized intermittent fans, like in a bathroom where you switch them on and it's like an airplane taking off. That's not the case. So their flow rates are quite low. They're running consistently, so they're super quiet.
And Stephen, again, if 2 years after a house is built and the BR is being carried out in a full MVHR system, if the SPF and HR isn't known default data that can be inputted. So yeah, so what kind of defaults do you go to, I guess, is
yeah, so it's your standard default. So I think that's, you guys would know better than me, but it's 2 for specific fan power. I think it's 66% efficiency for your heat recovery. You basically, if the information is not available, it's the same as any other system. You go back to defaults that are outlined in the DEEP manual. So I suppose those defaults wouldn't be system specific. That's for any MVHR system. If you don't know the data, you go back to your manual for defaults. It comes up anyway automatically in DEEP 4, I think, doesn't it? It's 2 and 66% as far as I know.
It does. Maybe the last one there now, because we're just hitting 12 o'clock. Yeah, a good question. How often should the system be serviced? Approximation costs. Are there filters to be replaced?
Yeah,
so running costs, yeah, maintenance.
Yeah, so the running cost is actually really, really low for these units, lower than a centralized system because they don't have pressure losses with ducting. That's the first thing. In terms of maintenance, it's quite easy. So let's take this one in the bedroom, for example, right? You pop off the front cover. There's a reusable filter inside. So you take that out and you wash it. So instead of throwing them away, you reuse them for 4 or 5 years. Eventually, of course, they'll start to disintegrate and you have to change to a new one. But you're changing those every 4 to 5 years as opposed to every year. So typically we recommend hoovering them every 3-4 months, the same as a centralized unit, and then just washing them once a year. The ducting, so I suppose it's a kind of an unspoken elephant. It's an elephant in the room with centralized systems. How do you maintain the ductwork? Do you need to clean it? How do you clean it, and so on? It is recommended to clean it. It can be challenging. Whereas with these units, they don't have any ducting. Basically, there's a tiny amount of duct about that length, that goes through your wall, but it's completely accessible. So, there's no issue there. If they do, for any reason, have a problem, which like these fans are tested to last for 30 years or more, it's not likely that they'll have a problem. But essentially, you just slide that out. First fix is core a hole and put in a sleeve. And after that, your unit slips in and out. So if there is a problem for any reason, you just slide it out, slide another one in.
So they're easy to get to. And what is the guarantee on them, for example?
So as far as I'm aware, it's a 2-year guarantee, same as any electrical goods. I don't think you can go beyond that. But of course, the expected lifespan is a different issue altogether. Guarantees and expected lifespan, I suppose. You tell people the guarantee is 2 years, and they think, geez, that's terrible. But that's just rules around electrical goods. It's not
tested to run to 15 or more, like most days. Okay, Dara, that is super. We're just going a little bit over time. So thank you very much. That was really good presentation, very clear.
No problem.
Maybe we can get you to share that Excel sheet with us, or maybe we can send it out with the CPD certs or something like that.
Yeah, so the Excel, the only reason we don't share that is the data changes all the time. So the Excel sheet isn't much good if the flow rates and the hours, that's project specific. But again, my email is on the screen there. If anyone wants to reach out to get versions of it or whatever, it's I suppose we're nervous to share it because then people are using one that's outdated all of a sudden and the figures aren't compliant.
I get you. So site specific and get it
exactly. Yeah. Okay. And even every time we get a new unit, the specific fan power might change slightly or something like that. So we're afraid of people using old versions and not being, I suppose, compliant then. That's
great. Due diligence, yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Dara. That's super. Yeah, Dara's all the details are up there, so anyone take note of them and get in contact. I'm sure he'll come back to you if you have any questions. So thanks very much to you and Partel for doing this for us. Very huge thanks to everybody on the CPD Stream 1, to John Barrett, Liam Donoghue, Michael Kyle, and our chair, Ollie, of course, who puts in lots of work in getting these